Great. Welcome everyone to our second Film Ontario Q&A sessions with mayoral candidates. For those of you who don't know, I'm Cynthia Lynch, Managing Director at Film Ontario, and I'm happy to be sitting down today with Mayor John Tory to talk about issues related to the film and TV industry in the city. So just a couple of notes on format. I have a list of questions. Thank you to those of you who sent questions in advance. So we'll start with those, but please feel free to send us your questions during the session and we will, the mayor said we could ask him anything. So we ask that you keep your questions related to the film and TV industry for today. So thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Welcome. I just want to start off really easily and give you a chance to introduce or reintroduce yourself to people and tell us why you want to be mayor again.
Well, I've come from a career that was varied. I was a lawyer, I was an executive at Rogers, and there came to understand how important communication, TV, film, digital were to people in the city and the country. And subsequent to that, I've been the mayor, and what I've really tried to do is move transit forward a great deal, make sure we dramatically increased our efforts with respect to affordable housing, kept taxes low, and fostered jobs and economic development, of which the film, TV, and digital industry has been a big part, not only because it creates and attracts jobs in and of itself, but because it's a beacon for the kind of creativity other industries want to see when they come to Toronto. And so I've tried to be a champion of that business, and but those are the things I've tried to do. Build transit, affordable housing, step up our efforts there, keep taxes low so people can afford to live here, and attract jobs and investment to the city, which I think is vital, and I think it starts with our reputation for creativity and innovation.
Excellent. So you did know a bit about the industry before you were mayor, as you said, from your background in broadcasting, but has there anything over the past 4 years that you've learned that really surprised you that you didn't know before about film and TV in the city?
I guess more than anything else, I came to appreciate how deep our talent pool is here. And sometimes you don't know that until you go somewhere else and they tell you. And so I agreed at the beginning of being mayor to take an annual trip, or as often as necessary, but it's been annual, to Los Angeles to pitch the studios on doing more business here, and all the different companies that are now, I guess, trying to become studios, the Amazons and the Netflixes and others. And in the course of so doing, they made some things very clear to me. Don't mess with the money. So that was a message more to go to the government of Ontario, because there was a bit of turbulence about the tax credits. Make sure that you keep the pool of talent deep, and in fact deepen it and broaden it. Make sure you have adequate studio space, which we had some homework to do and still do. And finally, keep the greatest customer service, which they gave us credit for, was the best customer service, really they implied, in North America, if not the world. And so, I learned mostly, though, about how big the talent pool already was, but how it can never be too big if you want to keep the big productions coming, because it stands to reason, that if a big production is coming in here, a TV show that comes here lasts for 5 years, you start to draw that talent pool into those orbits, and they're not available to do something else. So that's why, if we want to be ambitious, and it involves a bit of risk that you train, a larger number of people, but it just means you have to work all the harder, including me, to get those productions here.
So I think hopefully this is where you're going, but what role do you see the industry playing in the city over the next 4 years?
Well, it's hugely important in two or three respects. I mean, first of all, it is a big job creator. So, I mean, it's very important to me in that respect. I mean, if it employs, and you see anything between 30, 35, or even 40,000 jobs, and there aren't many industries that are as big as that. Secondly, it is an industry that is one of our best prospects for drawing people in and for attracting people in to do their work here using those 40,000 people. But once they've come, it puts Toronto on the map in many different respects. Thirdly, it is an industry that helps us tell our own stories, which I think is hugely important. So the Canadian part of this industry is very important to me because I think that Canadian film and television have really come into their own in the last 15 or 20 years. It used to be kind of regarded as, oh, well, it was kind of somehow, even we all said it was second rate. It's not anymore. I mean, there are shows now made here and movies made here that are, showing right up in the top class around the world. And then finally, I think it does wonders for the image of the city, for other investment in terms of showing us to be a place of creativity and innovation. And that's hugely important. Big employers that have nothing to do with film or TV or interactive have told me that one of the reasons they actually want to come here is they can see from our experience with film, TV, and interactive that we are committed to that and to arts and to culture. And that makes them make their business decisions for businesses nothing to do with that. So I think it's a very important thing for all those reasons.
So as you know, I'm always happy to hear you mention tax credits. So what do you see, and you have been a great advocate for us in the past, but what do you see ongoing as your role in advocating on behalf of the industry, particularly to province, but to all levels of government?
Well, I think it's really just don't mess with them. I mean, I think they're working. I think you have to keep an eye all the time because there's always somebody out there, and we've seen this with some of the states in the U.S. and so on, although I think they've also proven that if you just rely on the money, it's back to my point about money, studios, talent, customer service. If you just rely on the money and try and induce people in with huge bags of money, it probably won't work in the long term. But I think we have to make sure we don't mess with the money. I think we have to keep looking. When I was in India, again, I was in India in part selling to the huge film industry there. I said, look, you're producing 2,300 feature films here a year in this country. If you could just give us, 5% of those, we'd be thrilled. Because it would add, we have the capacity, we have the diversity to do it. And, they talked there about how some of our rules in the tax credits are rules that don't necessarily encourage them to come. So I think we've got to keep looking at that sort of thing and the flexibility. We've got to keep looking at what we're doing for special effects and for visual effects and for post-production, and make sure that we're, staying competitive even with our own, Canadian competitors in Vancouver. So I'll be fighting to make sure that what we have now is maintained and that we keep looking at it, constantly re-examining it to make sure it's right for the time. If it's 2019, then it doesn't necessarily mean that what was suitable for 2017 is the same. And I want to make sure that I listen to the industry and to the unions and be able to advocate to government to make sure they understand that there may be changes needed to keep up with an industry that itself is changing.
So talking about listening to the industry, we have had a film, TV, and digital media board in the past. Is that something that you see continuing?
Definitely, because what it's done is that most vital of things. It's fine to have a film office, and I view that as more of, and this is not to diminish what any of the people there do, but it's a service office that is meant to kind of make sure that we're outselling, but also that we're servicing when people come here. And serving as a bit of a catalyst. But I think the place where you're really going to get the kind of collaboration that we need in order to expand the studio space, expand the talent pool, and so on is going to be coming through a film and TV board where you have government represented there, you have the industry represented, you have the unions. I mean, we've seen, for example, when it comes to the real job of broadening the talent pool, that it's an initiative undertaken by the unions, by NABET and by IATSE, to work with the schools, to work with the industry, to work with the government. That's where we're going to get that broadening of the talent pool. That's one of the reasons why I've said in my election platform, and film is one of the areas I don't have a platform that's as big because most of it is to do with finishing the work I've started. But in the case of film, I've said, for example, we take our most successful youth employment program, which youth, in this case, extending up to age 29, and include the film industry in it, where previously it hasn't been included. So we're helping some people that have maybe been a challenge to employ get an opportunity, but so too are the film industry benefiting from some of these very bright young people being made available to them, sort of pre-screened by us. So that just indicates a commitment that I would have to one of the kinds of things the Film and TV Board does, as well as making sure they're an advocate when it comes to things like making sure that in our planning decisions as a city, we take account of the needs of the film industry and don't treat it as something that can be sort of just pushed away as a nuisance, but rather I view it, and I do, as a perfectly outstanding opportunity that can be compatible with anything else we're doing. Because it's about jobs, it's about creativity, it's about a creativity hub that we can create around film precincts, plural, that can exist in the city, not just downtown, but everywhere in the city.
Excellent. So to expand a bit on the film precincts and expanding in the city, and you mentioned you've heard in LA the need for studio space. It's great to see that we've had several announcements in the past few months, and the city has worked very hard at reopening places like Showline. How do you plan to keep that momentum going, ensure that employment lands stay employment lands, and see what we can do to keep moving forward on this?
Well, a lot of it is discipline and determination. You just say, well, you're not going to be sort of pushed around by people who would like to take employment lands and turn them into something else. I mean, we have, for the waterfront, for example, a very balanced plan that's going to have everything. But it needs to have jobs. People need to work. It's going to have, residences. It's going to have lots of open and public spaces and so on. And what a wonderful community that will be, including one that is got a healthy presence by the film industry. I think that's a good thing. And I think we've shown our determination on things like Showline, where that was about to disappear into hands that were other than the film industry's hands. And we literally took the step of buying it back so that it could be preserved when we were short of studio space. I think we're presiding over an expansion, a couple of big expansions that are being named, and I think there's much more to come. What I'm also heartened by is the fact that, very much like LA, when I first went out there, I'd obviously not been around to the studios before, but when I went as mayor to sell Toronto, the studios are not all located in one place. They're located in different parts of the city. And I think that's going to be very healthy for us to have the expanding presence we have in Etobicoke, where you have William White, you have Sim, you have Cinespace, and I think you're going to have more. I think I've had indications there's going to be more going on in Etobicoke, which is not that far from downtown. I think it's terrific. Downtown, you have the expansion of Pine Woods, and you have the shoreline being sort of returned to the use for which we would all say it was intended. And you even have things happening in the Northeast, albeit in Markham, but I'm not worried about that. I mean, Markham is part of the GTA. I believe very strongly a rising tide lifts all boats, and it will be the same talent pool and the same things that help to make that a success. And while I'd like to have as much of this activity as I can, I don't want to be greedy in Toronto. I'm very happy if there are studios that set up shop in Markham to do their business, because I think that will just bring more of this activity, film, TV, and interactive, to the greater Toronto area.
So beyond sort of keeping that space for employment lands, are there other things you think the studio can do to encourage that type of inward investment?
Well, I mean, we'll see. I mean, I generally believe that private sector decisions that are made by private sector people on the basis that it's good business for them is the best way to have decisions made, because then what you haven't done is falsely sort of induce these people using money, and then 5 years later they're not making money, they're losing money, and they come to you and say this whole thing is not working well. I think that would be very unfair to the industry and unfair to the city. But I think there are a variety of kind of planning and zoning and other kinds of decisions we can make to ensure that we make the city of Toronto and different parts of it as attractive as we possibly can for film, TV, and interactive activity. And I think that's happening, but I think we just got to maintain our resolve on that and make sure that we do things to strengthen the presence of this industry and, frankly, address the identified needs of those who we want to produce here and film here and work here, which is, again, don't mess with the money, build the studio space we need, make sure we have the talent, and make sure we have the customer service. But that studio space is right in there as obviously something that's extremely important, but we need private sector people to make those decisions, with our job being to make this the most conducive environment we possibly can for them to make that decision.
And you alluded to this a bit earlier when we were talking about the film board, but when we get outside the studio, location shooting continues to be an important part of the industry, and sometimes that conflicts with other priorities like transit and traffic flow. So how will you work with the industry, or continue to work with the industry, to ensure that there's still access to public right-of-ways for shooting, and more, as importantly, the parking that goes along with supporting those kinds of films?
Well, we're going to have a new director of the film office, but the old one certainly was very good at putting up his dukes and making sure that the industry was fought for. And I think the public, interestingly enough, for all the inconvenience that may be caused by the trailers that are there one day for a couple of weeks or whatever, I think the public understand, because I actually get relatively few complaints in my office, because I think they get the fact this is creating, three things. One, a critical mass for the industry, which would not be happening if there weren't others here from out of town doing their productions. Two, a huge amount of economic activity and jobs and so on. And three, I think it's great for the image of Toronto, as a place that welcomes creativity and where we do provide customer service and allow vehicles to be parked or streets to be closed or whatever. And I think as long as we don't get completely carried away with it, most people are quite prepared to accept it. So I'd say more of the same. And I think it'll be an important component of the new office under new leadership, now that Zabe has gone to Los Angeles, that we should make sure the person understands it's customer service, customer service, customer service, which means, for me, what you'd like to find in your favorite restaurant. Almost anything you ask them to do, within, ambitious reason, is doable. And I think that should be our watchword at the film office and at the city government as a whole. Anything that people who are here creating jobs and doing productions in our city want within reason, that we'll do for them. And I think we've got to carry on with that. And, I think even to the point where some of the big productions come, I think we should do what we do in other areas of the city government, which is to say, if you've got a great big production here, we will assign somebody particularly to your project so that you can have one-to-one attention with the same person who can then navigate your way through the city government, so that if you need a permit in 24 hours, even though we prefer more notice, you get it. That should be the idea.
And does the same hold true for other things that aren't shooting but are industry related, such as Festival Street during TIFF, which...
Yeah, look, I've taken a few lash marks for that, but I mean, initially I said when the streetcar King Street pilot project was going on, we might not be able to do it, only because I was thinking, well, if we've just gone to all the lengths we did to make the streetcars run better, which they are much better, much more reliably and faster, how can you then close the street? But I think when we discussed it with all the stakeholders, including the streetcar riders, TIFF, the merchants, and so forth, everybody felt that for that 3 or 4 days, for what is one of the, and I'm not diminishing the city in saying this, one of the really global events we have. Not that many of them in Toronto. TIFF is a global event that we should be having the city seen for at least part of that time at its very best. And I think when you see the thousands of people walking along King Street on the street and all the kind of restaurants that are extended out into the street and people generally having a good time, I think, and I know from just talking to people, it reflects very well on the city around the world. So to me, I'd be trying very hard to make sure that Festival Street continues, because I think it does provide some short-term disruption for a couple of days. It provides huge dividends at the same time.
So I want to go back to the film office
Sure.
for a second. So as you mentioned, Zabe will be moving on, representing us, we hope, very ably in Los Angeles. But do you think this is an opportunity to take a look at the film office, see if there are things that they could be doing differently?
Yes.
Okay.
And I think the size of the industry is such now, as you say, it's gone from sort of our ambitious goal a few years ago before my time was $1 billion, and now we're kind of touching $3 billion. And so I think it's time to look at the person in there. I mean, the film commissioner, which is not really what he's called. I guess
Right.
He's called presently, or he or she, the director of, I think, what is it, film and entertainment or something. By definition, that is more than just film, and it's more than just film, TV, and interactive. So we've got to ask ourselves the question: if it's a $3 billion a year industry, is that enough resource being directed to that alone? Let alone something else I treasure, which is music. And I'd like to see us do the same thing with music we have done with film, and we've been making quite a lot of efforts in that regard. But I think you can't allow it to happen sort of at the expense of film, in terms of the attention that somebody is paying to film, not just to the kind of broader strategic implications of getting more productions in here, but also to the servicing part, and being the partner at the film and TV board table where you're talking about the training of more talent and so forth. So to me, I think it's a great occasion when somebody leaves, as much as we regret to see Zabe go. It's a great occasion to re-examine the role and kind of see if we're if we're doing our part to make sure we have a person there that is devoted enough to the film part of this, knowing there are other parts of the job as it presently exists.
And does that include possibly increased resources for the film office?
Well, look, yes, it does. It has to. I mean, you can't sort of say, well, what you're going to do is, hire 3 more people or change the nature of the job in terms of its responsibilities, but then say you're going to flatline the budget. So I think it does, and I think that's what we have to look at. And, I'm very much a believer that you do these things based on the assumption you're going to get a return, and the return isn't always in money. But if Toronto, I think we're facing a lot of competition right now from Vancouver, I know for a fact, even from Montreal. Let's forget about New York, LA, et cetera. And so I love our friends in Vancouver and Montreal. They're Canadians. But I think our industry is the best. I think our talent is the best here. I think our studios are, need to be a little more numerous, but they're very good. And so I want to make sure that, we press hard to do the things we have to do. And if that means we're going to sort of say, well, what we invest in the film office or whatever it gets called is going to pay a return that's 3 times that, then that to me is a pretty good deal.
Great. So I think we have a question. So Mayor, what is your plan for building the human infrastructure in the screen-based industry? So we talked a bit about talent training.
Yeah, I mean, I think really when you say my plan, I mean, I think the city government is actually the least involved in this, in the sense that if you look at it, the city government doesn't have any responsibility for education and training. What we are is good collaborative partners. And so I think what my job can be, and I've tried to do this in the first 4 years I've been mayor, was to bring the people together in the industry. And frankly, this is one of those industries where they didn't need all that much bringing together by me. I mean, you had the ACTRAs and the NABETs and the IATSEs taking initiatives on their own with the industry to train people and to hook up to the school system and all this kind of thing. So I think what I mentioned earlier on was something that I can do, which is to take the film industry and include it in our most successful program for Harder to Employ Young People, because out of that will come, I have no doubt, based on its track record, huge numbers of opportunities for kids that presently find themselves isolated from a lot of the growth in the film industry, and they would be fascinated to be a part of it. And so I think that's the role we can play, is to help sort of bring together and screen people so the film industry can have at some of the best and the brightest who presently might say, well, how do I ever get a job in that industry? Well, the answer is we introduce you to that industry, and then you go and show your stuff and you get hired. So I think we can help with that, but I think a lot of the initiative has to come from exactly where it has been coming from, which is the corporate players in the industry, meaning all the industries, big and small companies, and the unions, who I think they're very good at training people. And they know how to do that. This is what they do. I mean, among other things, they collectively bargain, but they also train people. And I think that our relationships with them are incredibly healthy. They go as partners on the trips that I take, and I really rely on them as almost the number one partner to make sure we can create those opportunities for the young people you asked about.
I think we have another question running through. So maybe we can expand a bit. The question is, what is the mayor's plan for protecting current and new studio capacity? So
well, I mean, I think we talked about it. I think it involves our own planning decisions, because obviously if we put some of those at risk by sort of allowing every place in Toronto to become zoned for condos, that'll be a problem. So we're not doing that. I think we've proven our bona fides on that. Even when the Portland's plan was, for example, criticized by someone saying, well, what are you going to have these great big empty sort of barn-like buildings set aside for? And I was quite comfortable in defending that on the basis of saying they are big buildings in which a lot of exciting activity takes place that employ a lot of people and that really stand as a beacon to people who want the city to be a hub of creativity and innovation and artistry. So I think that's number one. And the second thing I would say is we've shown our bona fides. When somebody tried to take away, not deliberately, but when a purchaser came along and Showline was purchased by somebody who was not in the film industry, who had a clear desire to change the direction of that building in a very radical way that cut the film TV production business out, we bought the building back. And I don't think it didn't cost us a lot of money in the sense that we now have that asset. So it's not as if we sort of said, well, we're just going to write a check that's going to be kind of dispensed for operating purposes. This is a great investment for us. We own that land, but it meant that we saved that as a place for production activity, which otherwise it would have gone the way of the dodo bird.
Cass is getting another question ready for us, but while we're waiting, I just want to talk about, we've touched on some of the priorities on the 2017 Strategic Action Plan for the industry. Is there something in that plan that we haven't done yet that you would like to see as a priority?
No, I think we've made some progress on all of it. I think they're all kind of initiatives that are in their earlier stages. So we are, we have commitments to build, from Pinewoods, from CineSpace, and I think in CineSpace's case, they're actually underway. And so I think that's underway. The customer service thing is a constantly evolving thing, but I know people are on top of it because they tell me and they show me. The talent thing, I think, is underway in a number of different ways with the unions, with the schools, with our employment program. And then the last piece is the customer service piece, which I think we continue to do quite well. And even to the point where, I hear that there's actually a couple of fairly major productions coming here. And I've just said, look, I mean, please give consideration, because I don't instruct them as to what to do. They operate, as a somewhat independent entity within the public service. But I've said, please, you'd be keeping me happy, and I believe keeping the customers happy, if you assign somebody to these bigger productions and said, your job is to make these people leave Toronto and say this was the best place I've been in the world to make a movie or a TV show. And that's what I want people to say, the best place. So I think it is actually more of the same, as much as that sometimes doesn't sound very exciting. I think we're doing well. I think we've got to keep a very close eye, and I'd be sort of having somebody go out once a month just to look around, as they say, at Vancouver. I mean, Vancouver, we know, has the time zone and the geography that helps it. And I'm not putting them down at all, but they have those two things that we really can't do anything about. I mean, and maybe you might even argue better weather in some months of the year. But I think we have to look at what their competitive, opportunities are that they keep presenting to people, in order to just make sure we put our oar in and we get our fair share. But I think a lot of that has to do with, what we were just talking about in terms of the things we have to do to make sure people know that we're interested and that we're good at it and that we're determined to grow the studio space and grow the talent pool.
And also the advocacy, which is part of it.
Well, no, it's a big part of mine.
It's always ongoing.
I will go and advocate, and I say to the people from the industry, I will go and advocate anywhere, anytime, as long as it's a good use of my time. And I think I've proven that too. I mean, I've sort of met with all kinds of people that have been brought to my office to bring productions here and whatnot, and some of it's worked and some of it may not yet have worked, but I think the fact you do it, indicates your interest, and it indicates right up to the level of the mayor of the city that this is something I give them my business card, I think, as you know, and I say to them, I kid them and say it's a get-out-of-jail-free card, which I've had to explain to Americans, well, that's not true. We don't have such a thing as a get-out-of-jail-free card. But what I do say to them, well, I say one thing kiddingly, which is if you ever get into jail, I'll certainly come and visit you as mayor. But what I really mean to say to them, and I get this across because I can kid about it a bit with them, is that we are going to give customer service that I want them to say is the best in the world. And they've often said, with a couple of very limited exceptions, that we do a great job at that, and we have to continue to do so. And it engages people in the industry, too, to have them helping you provide that customer service. They're not all filmmakers and directors. They're people who are sometimes just film buffs, and they'd love to be around that whole world.
So what accomplishment are you most proud of in the film, TV, and digital media industry?
I'd have to say that it is really, there's two. I mean, one is the fact that we formed these, when I say we, the industry's formed these partnerships with the unions. I think taking the unions on our trips, when I go to Los Angeles to sell, I take the union presidents with me. And people are surprised. When in India, they couldn't get over this, that they were actually with us on the trip to say, yeah, we're here too, to tell you we'll work hard for you, because I think they have a much more sort of adversarial kind of relationship. But the second thing would be the efforts that we've undertaken to protect studio space. I mean, it was a difficult decision at the city council, I will tell you, for us to buy a building back we had just sold. Well, we hadn't sold it, but the owner had sold it, and we had sort of hoped that it would stay in the hands of the film industry. But it just had been sold, and we actually bought it back, so that we could then, in turn, make sure it was used for film. And I hope ultimately somebody buys it from us who's going to use it for film, but in the meantime, I'm very happy that we should have it in public ownership. It's an appreciating asset, and it also is an asset that gives you some return every day, because the people who work inside are part of a thriving industry, and it gives you some competitive studio space to use for your for your productions.
So, while our tech catches up, okay. So what legacy do you want to leave for the film industry 4 years from now?
I want it to be seen for where it's almost at, and I think we're just inches away from being seen as indistinguishable, aside from historical reference, to that exists in Hollywood and even New York. I mean, I think we're almost there. I mean, I think it's an unbelievable trajectory that's been followed because of the talent, mainly. Because of the financial incentives, they've certainly got people here to see what we can do, so that gave us the chance to prove ourselves. Because of some of the studio space, although I think that's one where we've really got to keep our eye on the ball in terms of expanding it. And I just want people to sort of say that was the best. As I said earlier on, I want people to leave here who've made anything, a TV show, a feature film, and say that was the best place I've ever made a film, TV show, interactive game, whatever, in the whole world. And that they were attractive to me financially, they had incredible talent, they had great studio space if I needed it, and they made it worth my while financially. And that is really what I want people to say about this industry, because I think if you achieve that, it'll be huge dividends for jobs, for the creative and innovative, reputation of the city, for all the people who are artists and people behind and in front of the camera. I think it'd just be a great thing for us. If we have that reputation, but we're just kind of maybe still struggling to get right up to the point where we're seen on a par. I think we're seen just below them, but I think we just got to take that extra push, because we can do it. We've got the talent here. We've got the critical infrastructure in the business. We've got the great people who work for the union who are very talented and committed. It's an unusual thing to have that kind of commitment between the employer and the collective bargainer. I mean, I think we've got it here. They're terrific. They're good people to work with. So I think my challenge is just to show whatever leadership the industry asks me to show on advocacy, on protection of existing things like the tax credit, on the customer service, which we can make sure happens inside the City Hall, and on a plan to both preserve and expand studio space in locations without having a civil war, a civil war over it.
So I think we have time for one more question. So how can the city work with the industry to attract new and varied production from U.S. and international? So I think more beyond the U.S.
Yeah, my sense is that the industry are doing this fairly well themselves, and that they're reaching out to their sort of industry counterparts, and it's kind of pitching Toronto in a way that it's funny, because I find with every business, whether it's movie or when I'm off selling the high technology community or whatever, that people don't know that much about Toronto, so they'd be unaware. We all know because we sit and tell each other, and I think in LA they kind of know about the size and scope of the film industry and the talent pool here. But I would suggest, to your point, that I think lots of people in the United States and lots of people in other countries don't know. And I think we've got to go out and sell, and we've got to sort of set some targets as opposed to just selling to everybody anytime. So, for example, I would see Netflix and Amazon, as they increasingly get into more of their own production, as prime people to locate a studio here, so that means once you build a studio in the city of Toronto, you're going to be coming here to do a lot of your productions. Whereas as long as they haven't, they come here sometimes, but it's still easy for them to say, well, we can go somewhere else and rent a studio or go a place where we do own one. So I'd like to see some of those people stepping up and joining the parade of people who are sort of refurbishing or building a studio space. But and I'm very proud of the fact we've done all those things. I'm proud of the fact we saved the Shoreline building. I think that was a major gesture of commitment and an actual commitment to the industry, that we would buy back a building that had been sold and say, no, we're buying this back so our film industry can use it, much as there are other spaces in other parts of the city. I suppose they could have used it, they hadn't had that one. And it's a very cool sort of, space now. I mean, that it's going to be, I think it's going to be even cooler. We've got the marine terminal coming on board. And I just think there's a lot of positive developments with much more to come.
So I said that was the last question, but I forgot to ask you at the beginning what you're binge watching or have on your PBR now.
Well, I just finished watching the second season of Ozark. I mean, in my job, you don't get much time to watch any television of anything. And then I watched Ozark, and it was only, unfortunately, 10 episodes. Like, they're sort of left, and you're saying, my God, now I have to wait till next March? I think it was, or April when it came out, or some even later, maybe. I watched another one, and I'll forget the name of it. It was called The Magnificent Mrs. Somebody or other, I forget. And I watched some good old-fashioned, Canadian TV shows. Like, again, it's back to some of my cornball humor that I like, but I sort of love Schitt's Creek. I love Kim's Convenience, so I'll often binge. I never watch those on regular television. I just don't have time. And so I will watch those, and you can watch 4 or 5 of those because they're sort of half an hour, and you can watch 4 or 5 of those at a stretch. And so mine is a wide variety. It's usually stuff that, Ozark's pretty dark, but I often prefer things that are funnier. And that Magnificent Mrs. whatever it is, Mrs. Maisel, it's funny. I mean, it's funny, and it's done. It's sort of a period piece done in what about the 1950s, I think, by the looks of the cars and so forth. So I enjoy any of those, and my wife is more just because she will actually kind of take the time to talk to people about what we should watch, and then I just come home and I'm happy. I am so happy when I settle myself into a chair to be able to watch TV and binge watch for an hour or two, like say 2 or 3 episodes or something. You can't imagine, because you get no time to do that, and I find it incredibly and wonderfully relaxing. So I do it, but those are the things that are presently on our list, Ozark being finished for this year, and a couple of the others that we're working our way through.
Great. Yeah. And so I want to thank you again for taking the time today.
Thank you.
Remind everyone, thank you for tuning in. If you missed part of it, we'll post it on the website afterwards. And remember that the election is coming up really soon on Monday, October 22nd. If you haven't received your voter information card, you can still vote. Just go to myvote.toronto.ca to find out all the information you need about your polling station and what ID you need to bring. So thank you again, Mayor Tory, and thank you to everyone who tuned in today.
Thank you.